welcome to the Bougie Sports Podcast. I'm Yvette, your host, and as always, I am so excited that you're here. Today, I think, is going to be a really interesting, exciting pod. Next week, I am going to meet with Johnny Ciccatelli, who does so much for the Youngstown Mob. One of the administrators of the Youngstown Mob Facebook. They have an amazing podcast company that puts out so many great podcasts. Check it out. And they're also, he also was one of the producers of Cricket City. So again, if you have not listened to Cricket City, you can find that on Apple Podcast. Listen, if you are in a car lot or, at night, I don't know, in your headphones or, like I said, on your commutes. It's so interesting. And that's really where this podcast is taking off of. This is just paying homage to that podcast. They're the ones that do all the work. I'm just, enjoying their research, what they have done, and presenting it to you guys. So also, think they said they are announcing a kind of like a mafia tours thing in Youngstown or an app that you can check out where you can hit out all these spots. And I think that is so cool. So we will ask him about that next week. So so please, if you're enjoying this, stay tuned because this is just the beginning. This is just me getting ready to do the podcast, the man behind the man, the podcast behind the podcast. So just stay tuned and yes, it's gonna get better, and I'm gonna bring on more people, more guests. My friend Vince Guerreri, who does a lot of work with the Youngstown Mob as well, is going to help me coming up, and have some guests coming up as too, some real life people, and some people that tell their story in Cricket City. So thank you so much again for all your comments, your emails, your everything. I am enjoying hearing your stories, and I love that you're enjoying learning about this part of history, which is so interesting. Before Youngstown was middle ground for Browns and Steelers fans, it was the middle ground for the mob. So that's really how the history of Youngstown, placed right between two major cities. Everybody wanted that territory, and we're always split between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. And it seems like that now that Cleveland and Pittsburgh's fans, which it's kind of funny. So I guess we all know what part of the mob I am in. So okay, so I'm going to show you a clip from. I will make sure I want to show credit to who it is. I'll put it down here where the podcast is at because I'm just getting this from YouTube, but it's so good and it leads right into what we're going to start talking about and going more in depth into following this podcast and getting into the Jim trafficking years. So much, my God, layers and layers. I'm so excited for you guys to check this out and stay tuned. Thank you.
Youngstown, Ohio holds a special place in gangland. It was a city built for the mob, and it has a dark history. The city became ground zero in a vicious gangland battle for supremacy between factions of the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Mafia families that had planted its flags there. Although not an openly declared gang war, it was instead a bloody tug-of-war.
Right.
Youngstown, Ohio holds a special place in gangland. It was a city built for the mob, and it has a dark history. The city became ground zero in a
million time. Here you go.
Youngstown, Ohio holds a special place in gangland. It was a city built for the mob, and it has a dark history. The city became ground zero in a vicious gangland battle for supremacy between factions of the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Mafia families that had planted its flags there. Although not an openly declared gang war, it was instead a bloody tug-of-war that raged on and off sporadically for over 40 years. And both of these factions had a propensity for using car bombs as a favored way to eliminate their enemies. This is that story. Located on the Mahoning River, Youngstown, Ohio is just 65 miles southeast of Cleveland and 61 miles northwest of Pittsburgh. Although its population was too small to warrant a resident Cosa Nostra family itself, Youngstown, Ohio would nonetheless become ground zero in a long and vicious gangland battle to rule over its lucrative rackets. In many ways, Youngstown had it worse by not having a resident mafia family to call its own. One strong underworld entity that governed its territory with an iron fist for all to respect and fear. Because what happened instead was that several different mafia families made a bloody grab for it. Additionally, there were many independent racketeers and hoodlums who tried staking a claim and planting a flag on its soil as well. The result was bedlam. Even decades before its decline, the Youngstown underworld was always a mixed bag. Its geographic proximity to both Pittsburgh and Cleveland made it a prized plum back in the heyday of the mob, dating back to Prohibition times. Each of those cities had its own resident mafia family, and each cast their greedy eyes on the diamond that was Youngstown. Although it was technically situated in the state of Ohio per se, because of its close proximity to both cities, Youngstown became what was known as an open city as far as underworld rules, doctrine, and lingo goes. Back in the 1940s, a Cosa Nostra pact was agreed upon between Cleveland's Scalish family and Pittsburgh's LaRocca family to share equally in any racket revenue generated within the city. Each family appointed several resident mob figures, associates, and members alike native to the area to represent the respective factions. The Scalish Licavoli family and the LaRocca Amato family were allies of sorts, since both were officially recognized entities of the American Mafia's patchwork of groups laid out across the U.S. And allies they were, but they would also become deadly competitors as they vied for the revenue that was being generated out of Mahoning County. Boss John Scalish and his successor John Jack White Licavoli and Sebastian John LaRocca, as bosses of their respective brigadas, were of course at the helm of this conflict, but on the surface at least maintained proper mafia decorum as was expected of men of honor. If they had really wanted to, though, either one or both of those mafia families could have stopped with a simple wave of their hand the bloodshed that would eventually spill, but they never did. There was way too much money involved for either to turn their head in another direction and leave the spoils to the other. But boys will be boys, as the old adage goes, and these boys played rough. Despite this underworld agreement, unwritten of course, but sealed with a handshake and a Sicilian kiss on both cheeks in old world European style by their respective Brigada Representante, the pact never really held. The Pittsburgh and Cleveland factions would secretly be at war with each other through the decades. Not a declared open gang war by a shot fired over the bow, but a tit-for-tat type shadowy guerrilla warfare. A theoretical and at times literal tug-of-war between these two mafia factions raged on and off sporadically for over 40 years. Both factions' propensity for using car bombs as a favored way to eliminate their enemies brought the city a dubious moniker. These bombings became known as the Youngstown tune-up. Short of declaring open war against one another, they would each vie for bloody control of Youngstown's lucrative gambling operations and other rackets. The opposing factions would make surgical strikes against one another through the years, oftentimes denying and refusing to acknowledge they even bombed or murdered each other's men. Bookmaking, numbers, crap games, slot machines, illegal after-hours nightclubs, shylocking, prostitution, narcotics, and a whole lot more, all protected by a deeply ingrained corrupt political machine and city and state government that knowingly and happily worked hand in hand with the underworld. It was a town ideally built for the mob. Youngstown's crime, corruption, and gang killings became so bad that in 1963, the Saturday Evening Post dubbed the area Crime Town, USA, noting, "Officials hobnob openly with criminals. Arrests of racketeers are rare, convictions even rarer still, and tough sentences almost unheard of." The newspaper also wrote that the time has now come for action on the part of the whole citizenry, Until each honest man is aroused, the cesspool will remain, and Youngstown will remain a shame to the nation. At the center of this conflict, with lines in the sand drawn, were several key racketeers and made members of the mafia from each borgata. Ronnie the Crab Carabia and his brothers represented Cleveland, and Sandy Naples and his brothers Jimmy, Billy, and Joey represented Pittsburgh. Some others prominent in Youngstown's underworld for the Cleveland faction were old-line mafiosi Charles Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro, Salvatore Sam and Giuseppe Joe the Wolf DiCarlo, and Vince De Niro. In later decades, starting in the 1970s, were the Joey Naples and Lenny Strollo factions operating under Pittsburgh's flag. As a side note, the mob in Youngstown had such impunity from the law that Ron Carabia had beaten a burglary trial after members of the jury were openly threatened with death if he was found guilty. Such was the state of affairs in 1960s Youngstown. The following is a chronological history of some of the events that make up what is known as the Youngstown Bombing Wars. It's certainly not a complete list and may never be, not even on the Button Guys website, because of the very haphazard nature and sheer lunacy of the violence. Shootings, sniper attacks, and a massive series of bombings unlike any other mafia city in America. It got to the point that Youngstown gained another moniker and notoriously came to be called Bombtown, USA. Let's begin. Santino Sandy Naples Di Napoli was one of 4 notorious racketeer brothers active in numbers lotteries and other Youngstown rackets representing Pittsburgh. On March 11, 1960, he was caught short by 2 mob gunmen who were waiting in the shadows off the porch of his girlfriend's home. Brandishing 2 sawed-off shotguns, Sandy, who was only 52 years old at the time, and his 28-year-old girlfriend were hit by buckshot on the front stoop of their home. Naples had managed to empty his .38 caliber revolver at his assailants to no avail. Both shotguns were later found abandoned in a sewer. It was widely suspected but never proven that Cleveland capo Charles Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro and his close minion Vince De Niro were behind Sandy Naples' killing. On August 6, 1960, Cleveland faction associate Vincent Osenzi is shot to death and dumped in a ditch. Several days later, his brother Silvio was found hung in his garage. Word was that the Innocenzi brothers had attempted to kill, but missed, a Pittsburgh Mob figure several weeks earlier. On December 15, 1960, a strong-arm enforcer for Sandy Naples by the name of Big John Schuler is shot dead while he's changing a tire on a driveway in Warren, Ohio, about 17 miles north of Youngstown. Schuler had been car bombed several years earlier but survived that attack. This time, he didn't. On June 10, 1961, Lebanese-born Mike Farah is shotgunned while playing golf. Farah was a trusted overseer of the infamous gaming casino, the Jungle Inn, for the Pittsburgh Mob. On July 17, 1961, Cleveland faction strong-arm enforcer James Vince De Niro is vaporized in his car by a massive dynamite bomb that was placed underneath it. The sheer power of the explosion rocked the entire block, shattering bricks and windows a block away. The 39-year-old De Niro was an aide and protege of old-line capo Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro. On July 1, 1962, 35-year-old Billy Naples, the younger brother of Sandy, is blown to bits by a bomb while starting his car, which was parked in his garage. Billy had assumed his brother's mantle in controlling racket operations at the time of his killing. Before year's end, on November 23, 1962, Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro and his 2 young sons are blown to bits in the driveway of their home. Charlie had started the engine of his brand new Cadillac to drive his young sons to football practice when the bomb went off. 60-year-old Cavallaro, a highly respected Cleveland capo in charge of Youngstown, and his 11-year-old son Tommy were massacred. His other son, Charlie Jr., incredibly survived the bomb that had been placed under the car's chassis, but the deafening blast shattered the boy's body. He underwent extensive surgery to replace his hip and repair other serious injuries that left him crippled for life. On September 3, 1964, Pittsburgh Mob associate Dominic Nicky Moyo is found shot and bludgeoned to death in the trunk of his own car. A known enforcer, Moyo had been a prime suspect in both the Cavallaro and De Niro killings. On October 11, 1968, Cleveland faction hood Paul Caluti is shotgunned and killed. It was said this was another killing ordered by Naples crew leader Little Joey Naples to consolidate his faction's power. After a long hiatus from gangland warfare, Charles Charlie the Crab Carabia disappears on December 13, 1980. A Cleveland mob associate and overseer of the Youngstown faction, he had been going to a meet at the time of his disappearance. One of three brothers known for their arrogant, nasty, disrespectful ways toward other wise guys, Carabia was considered a loose cannon by both Pittsburgh and his own Cleveland superiors, who eventually grew tired of him, allowing Pittsburgh permission to kill him. On April 18, 1981, Pittsburgh faction member and enforcer Joseph Little Joe DeRose Jr. disappears and was never heard from again. He was a son of a mobbed-up Union official of the same name. Little Joe's car was later found abandoned and set ablaze. A subordinate of Capo James Briarhill Jimmy Prado, DeRose was considered unstable and arrogant. It was believed that he was murdered by his own faction for stepping out of line. On August 19, 1991, the chickens came home to roost. Joseph Little Joey Naples DiNapoli, the youngest of the Naples brothers, became the good fellow in charge of Youngstown for Pittsburgh after the death of his longtime superior, old-timer Briarhill Jimmy Prado. Naples was doing very well for himself, having ascended to the throne and overall control of the Youngstown rackets, a feat his older brothers never achieved. But jealousy reigned supreme in the mafia. Upstart Pittsburgh faction soldier Lenny Strollo plotted his assassination to try and usurp Naples' power and position. One afternoon, while visiting the construction site of a beautiful new mansion that little Joey was building for himself and his family, a sniper perched in a tree out in the field shot Naples in the head, killing him instantly. 40 years of strife for a Naples brother to finally ascend to be the boss of Youngstown, only to get a carbine rifle slug in the forehead. On June 3, 1996, an overly ambitious Pittsburgh faction associate named Ernest Ernie B. Biondillo has his car blocked in front and back by several work and crash cars while driving down a side street on his way to work one morning. Set up by Lenny Strollo, who farmed the hit out to a couple of kids he knew, Biondillo was shot multiple times and killed while trapped in the front seat of his Jeep. Biondillo had been closely associated with Joey Naples and Jimmy Prado prior to their deaths. Strollo viewed Biondillo as unwanted competition in Youngstown. And there were other less publicized or never publicized gangland homicides committed through those same decades related to the struggle for supremacy over the Youngstown gambling rackets. After a major investigation partially triggered by the killings of Naples and Biondillo, the man who rose to become Pittsburgh faction leader, Lenine Lenny Strollo, his brother Dante Danny Strollo, and several others in his group were all arrested. All were subsequently indicted for murder, conspiracy, bribery, and official corruption for the deep infiltration and subverting of Youngstown's and Mahonings County's local government and other racketeering charges. Both Strollers would eventually turn rat on each other and against the various wide swath of politicians they'd corrupted over the years. It became an even larger corruption investigation that saw the dismissal, arrests, and indictments of a slew of top political figures and local law enforcement. Paramount to those later indicted on corruption charges was U.S. Congressman James Traficant, a Youngstown native born and bred there who later rose to a position of prominence. It was alleged that Traficant's entire political campaign and career were indeed financed by the joint effort of both the Pittsburgh and Cleveland families in order to better control any police probes and investigations. Originally running as a candidate for sheriff in 1980, Traficant had made a deal with the devil by accepting $60,000 cash from the Pittsburgh Mob, and shortly thereafter secretly accepting another $100,000 from Cleveland's mob. He tried playing both ends against the middle, always a bad idea, especially when those two ends are opposing mafia factions. By 1985, Traficant had been elected to Congress, a position he would be re-elected to time and again. Eventually, several judges, city attorneys, and other government officials would be drawn into the scandal as well. It was a huge mess and embarrassment. And once again, it became a black eye for the city of Youngstown, or should we say, Crime Town, USA. And here's a little bit of a side story. As quiet and shadowy as the mob in Pittsburgh was for most of its tenure, the opposite was true for its Cosa Nostra neighbor in Cleveland. No other city outside of Youngstown had more bombings than them. In 1977 alone, police recorded 37 bombing incidents in the Cleveland area, prompting one local newspaper to dub the city the bombing capital of America. Both years before and after, bombings took the lives of or seriously injured multiple hoodlums, including Irish mobster Danny Green, who was also a longtime paid informant for the FBI. After many murder attempts, he was finally blown to smithereens in a car bombing by the Licavoli faction. ILA labor union enforcer Arthur Sneppiger, Cleveland gambler Joe Allen, Scalish family enforcer Eugene the Animal Ciasulo, and Jewish policy racket boss Shandor Burns. Other murders included garbage carting owner Mike Fratto. He was injured in a car bombing and later shot to death to finish the job. John Conti, who disappeared and was later found bound, gagged, and bludgeoned to death. Newly installed Cleveland underboss Leo Lips Mosseri, who disappeared one day and has never been found since. Frank Percio, an innocent neighbor of mobster Ali Calabrese, who went to move Ali's car and was mistakenly blown to bits. And one of the main antagonists in the deadly conflict in Cleveland was John Nardi, a rebel mobster and Teamsters official who had been at odds with his former Cleveland mob associates. Nardi was vaporized in a massive bombing of his car as he left his union headquarters one afternoon. Who knew bombing could be such big business? To read more about the Pittsburgh and Cleveland Mafia families, head on over to Button Guys of the New York Mafia website at www.thenewyorkmafia.com.
That's some crazy stuff right there. That's some real stuff right there. That is amazing. I visited where Sandy Naples got murdered, allegedly by the Cleveland Mob, Ronnie Carabia in Youngstown today. And oh my God, that was so much fun. So I am headed to the Sandy Naples hit.
A year later, late winter of 1960, one of the most sensational gangland killings in local history took place. It claimed the life of racketeer S. Joseph Naples. Everybody called him Sandy. He'd done a long stretch in prison for severely beating a man during a robbery that netted just $2.12. Sandy made big headlines in 1958 while serving a gambling sentence in the Mahoney County Jail. He was caught slipping out on weekends to see his girlfriend. It was going to see her, Marianne Verancich, that led to Sandy's demise. Old-timers said you could set your watch by him. Every night about 11, he'd arrive on her front porch on Caledonia Street on the city's south side. That night, two hitmen stepped out from the shadows and gunned him down. Marianne had just opened the door to greet him. She, too, was killed by gunfire.
I attempted to talk to him. He appeared serious. However, I thought she would survive and we'd be able to talk with her at a later date. And she also expired. But this is where the scene was. And she was outside the door and he was lying right in here, partially behind this rail.
Sandy did not go quietly. He emptied his .38 snub-nosed revolver, but police couldn't find any blood trail to indicate that he'd hit either of his fleeing assassins. A shotgun left at the scene and a machine gun found 2 years later in a nearby storm sewer were linked to the slayings, but nothing ever came of it. Charlie Carabia was one of many possible suspects questioned in the Naples hit. No one was ever charged.
In 0.2 miles, the destination is on your right, 623 Caledonia Street.
So I am in front of 623 Caledonia Street. My hands are like shaking. This is where the Jimmy Naples hit was. I'm not quite sure. It looks like someone might still live here. In case you guys were wondering, did I take anything from that house? I mean, it looked like someone could still be living there. I'm not sure. Sorry if you are. I don't think that was trespassing. But I didn't. Okay. I didn't take anything. A couple of other spots that I wanted to go today, but it didn't, just the rain, it just started coming down, I wanted to go on Market Street and visit Isley's and Cicero's, where the car bombing went off and changed a lot. So I don't know. Or I don't even think it's there anymore. Or where it used to be. Also, I may or may have not be getting something else dealing with gym trafficking. Crazy. Oh my God. Thank you guys so much. You're the best. All right. Bye.